Good morning and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. Dear listeners, you have been listening to the lectures by Binod Mishra, and if you recollect well, we have been talking about Indian poets who have been writing or composing their poems in English and have made their mark in the field of even world literatures. In the previous lecture, we have talked about several Indian English poets who have actually depicted various themes in their poetry, and today we are going to start a new phase in the area of Indian poetry in English, and that phase is about those poets who have actually been living abroad, some of them who have settled abroad rather, but India still lies within them. India is steeped in their heart of hearts, and we call them diasporic poets. In this regard, the very first poet that we are going to talk about in this lecture today is AK Ramanujan or Atipat Krishnaswamy Ramanujan. Now, one of the major celebrated Indian English poets that AK Ramanujan was and still holds the attention of the world because of several reasons. He is an Indian English poet, and why is he so? Would like to know when you get to know the details of this poet and his poetic corpus. Now, who was AK Ramanujan? As I told you, we are going to discuss the diasporic poetry by Indian English writers. Now, of course, and quite naturally, you might be eager to know what actually is diasporic poetry or what is diaspora. So, before we go into the details, let us try to understand the diaspora is actually a group of poets, writers, whosoever who actually straddle between two cultures. I mean, one culture may be their own culture, their own identity, and the other is when they live abroad, they are actually carrying the cultures of their motherland. In this regard, if we can define diaspora, we can say it is actually a migration of people from one country to another. It actually started with Israel's, the Israelites who actually have been living in some other parts, but later on in literature, people from different countries who actually change their homelands either for a livelihood or for some other professional requirements or whatsoever, and sometimes or the other they settle abroad as well, they are considered to be diasporic people. Now, migration has become a reality, in a globalized world of today. I think you often might have heard people saying that world has become a global village, and in a global village, people from different countries, people from different faiths, different religions, different tastes, they will gather at a particular country, different countries rather, but then they are not able to forget, they are not able to say a goodbye to their first home or to their first culture. People may have diasporic experience either of first generation or of second generation and of course of third generation as well. Indian English writing has witnessed several diasporic writers, especially in the field of novel writing, and you might have also come across the novels of several Indian novelists who have also been awarded prizes, the several names that can come to your mind are Bharati Mukherjee, then V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, Anita Desai, Jhumpa Lahiri, then Chitra Banerjee, Deva Karuni, Rohinton Mistry, and many more, but all these people are novelists. But then this trend is not only confined to novel writing, rather it has also affected many poets, many Indian English poets, and we shall be discussing some Indian English poets who have actually been living abroad or had settled abroad, but then they have not been able to forego their Indian experiences as well as their memories, which actually have been haunting them from time to time. So, when we talk about diasporic literature, we also should know the several characteristic features, as I have been telling you. Majority of these people, whether a writer or a poet, their focus is on homeland. So, when the moment we talk about home, naturally several experiences gather in our minds. We at times feel dislocated, uprooted. We actually suffer from a sense of belonging. We feel displaced. Our identity is always at stake. So, there often is a sort of disintegration and the feeling of nostalgia, that is, your homeland always tries to keep you back. There is always a backward pull, and this backward pull is towards your homeland, towards your family people, towards your relatives, towards your kinsmen, to several rites, rituals, celebrations, festivals and all. So, this mobility between multiple places, they actually create a sense of diaspora. But when you are living in a diasporic country or a diasporic culture, you come across multiple identities. You do not remain one person, rather you become many persons. Now, when such a scenario is there, what actually should a diasporic writer do, or what a diasporic poet do, or what a diasporic poet does? In this regard, the name that we have been talking about, and the very first name is Atipat Krishnaswamy Ramanujan. Now, this poet also had to shift his identity. I mean, there was a sort of movement from India to abroad, and then when you go to stay at a different place in a different country, you actually keep struggling. There is always a yearning, there is always a search for our own identity, and you come across a cultural hybridism. And as a dislocated individual, as Pakistani diasporic writer says, the only way I could make sense of my confused world was to write. So, when you are sandwiched between two cultures, what you do? You actually want to express, and in order to express, what do? You write, and you take a medium, because through that you actually try to recover the lost identities, the identity of a struggling and a straddling between two cultures. Now, let us also try to see how can this diasporic experience make somebody a great poet. As I told you in the beginning, that AK Ramanujan was one of the most celebrated Indian English poets. Why did he become so, and what were the conditions? He was actually born in Mysore in 1929 in a Tamil Brahmin family. He got his early education in India, especially in Mysore, and then Deccan College, Pune. But for his PhD, he went to Indiana University, and in 1959, yes, in 1959, he not only went there, rather he also settled there. But having settled there, he could not settle there. He at times felt unsettled, because Indian experiences, Indian memories always kept haunting him. He was actually a professor of Dravidian linguistics at the University of Chicago. But then AK Ramanujan was not only a poet, he was also a translator, a linguist, a folklorist, a theoretician, and also a playwright. It is to his credit that not only did he write in Tamil, but he also wrote in Kannada, fine, and he was actually a trilingual poet and a tricultural poet also, you can consider him to be. So, he is considered to be one of the founding fathers or the founding figures of Indian poetry, especially modern, along with the Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moras, and many more. Now, when we know AK Ramanujan as a diasporic poet, we also should understand that he was not confined only to writing poetry. Rather, he also translated many of the Tamil poets and also into Kannada, fine. and he called himself in several interviews, he has called himself a hyphen between Indo-American poetry. He was living in Chicago, and his Indian experience, Indian memory, Indian associations which always haunted him, actually prompted him to write, and much of his writing actually is centered around India. Ramanujan also practiced Buddhist meditation technique to get relief from anxiety and dissatisfaction, because a poet is always the imprint of the surrounding that he lives in, and Ramanujan was not an exception, my dear friend. It is said, as I have read in one of the articles by AK Ramanujan, who says that Ramanujan in his earlier life wanted to become a magician, and for that he had got himself tailored a dress which could suit a magician. But my dear friends, though he could not become a magician in true self, he became a magician of words, and he started sifting words from one corner to another, and at the center of it was India, and India also. Because of his own achievements, he was also awarded Padma Shri in 1976. Later on, he got MacArthur Fellowship in 1983. He was also awarded Sahitya Akademi Award for English poetry, but that came too late. I mean, after his death. He got this award posthumously in 1999. And one thing that is actually quite unfortunate, that this Indian son of the soil breathed his last in Chicago in 1993. Now, actually, when we talk about Ramanujan, we should also talk about his poetic corpus. Ramanujan wrote 5 or 6 poetry collections, but you will find that his poetry collections actually have certain, gaps. He was not writing continuously only in English, rather he was also practicing his hand at translations. Many people consider him to only to be a translator. As Nagarajan considers him to be a translator alone, but it was actually because of his experience of translating alone that he could come to know of several mythological stories, and the rich remnants of our Indian mythology, which has actually crept in his work one after another. So, the very first work that Ramanujan started was the Striders, which came out in 1966. We will see that when he wrote Striders actually is full of, it can be considered to be a sort of hinterland of memory, where you can come across many of his past experiences, many of Indian superstitious beliefs, which Ramanujan in a very scientific manner at times mocks at, digs at, but then he is not able to unlearn it, because that was in his blood. And then in 1971 came Relations. After that, there was Second Sight, which came in 1986. Actually, Relations are devoted to many of the Hindu poems, because he was out and out a Hindu, and at times he criticized some of the lapses of this Hindu culture or Hindu religion, but then he always felt himself proud to be considered a Hindu. Then came Second Sight. Second Sight also tells us or makes us familiar with his knowledge of ancient Indian texts, especially Hindu myths and legends, where we can find quite a good number of, poems which are soaked in Indian sensibility. It is said that half of the poems that Ramanujan wrote were based on Hindu mythological stories. Then came The Black Hen in 1995, and then after that, I mean, because he left us in 1993, even after that we find that one of this collection, The Black Hen, came posthumously, and again collected poems also came in 1997. Some of the poems of his own were read at his funeral, and Ramanujan was a very famous teacher, and he always devoted his time along with his students, and he always tried to give his best to his students. You can always find that Ramanujan initially at one point of time he was asked to teach Tamil, and what he did not know much of Tamil, but he tried to find out some books on Tamil and then consulted some books of grammar on Tamil, and then, as you know well, that he actually was a professor of Dravidian linguistics. Now, as I have been saying, that Ramanujan was not confined only to writing in English. His other works, namely of essays, which came out in 1973, that was Speaking of Shiva, then came Folk Tales from India, then Flowering Tree and other oral tales from India, 300 Ramayanas at a time. You know, it also had become a very controversial thing because of certain interpretations of Ramayana. Now, you would also like to know what makes AK Ramanujan a distinct poet. As I have been saying, that since India had actually been ingrained in his veins, in his blood, he at times used to criticize, but then he was a great admirer of Indian culture. You can find that his poems are on different, subjects. He is not confined only to one subject, but through his own delineation of them, he actually tries at times to mock, at times to sock, and at times also to give you some pleasure which you could have never thought of. He actually was not a blind follower of Indian culture. Even though he was ingrained in Indian culture, but he was not a blind follower, and that is why he has criticized some of the lapses and the taboos of Indian culture. You can also find a sort of conflict between tradition and modernity in his poems. I mean, as many of the critics have also said, that majority of his poems are related to family association, kinsmen, parents, mother, sisters, but then he has also talked about insects, snakes, animals, fine, of trees around himself. So many people also consider him to be a sort of a poet who has his concern for nature as well. But then one thing that is quite noticeable in him is that he did not isolate himself, and never did he consider himself to be an American, even though he was living in America. But then he did not want to live in isolation, even though he had these bouts of isolation. He admired togetherness and then created some visual impacts or visual impressions, fine, through his poetry. He theorizes Indian oral tradition and Indian folk tradition as well. It would be better if we can take up some of the poems in order to understand what sort of poet was AK Ramanujan. AK Ramanujan, actually, if we have a look at his poetic creation, I mean, he was a poet who believed that poetry resides or poetry exists even in common things that actually we leave unnoticed. Now, here is an example of one of the poems which is from one of his first collections named The Striders, which came out in 1966. The poem is entitled Which Reminds Me, and you know, if we have a look at the lines of the poem, you will understand what sort of poet Ramanujan was. Now, not only there is a flow, he may not be a metrical one, but then the musicality he creates through the spontaneity that is there in Ramanujan's work, that actually makes us all spellbound. So, here is the poem. Let me read some of the lines so that you can have a thorough justification of Ramanujan as a poet. I have known that measly looking man, not very likeable, going to the bank after the dentist catching a cold, at the turn of street, sitting at the window of the local bus, suddenly make a poem which reminds me of the thrown away seed. Now, through his, because Ramanujan was ironic also, and there are ironic images. Now, here you can find which reminds me of the thrown away seed of the folktale tree, feeling with child, the mangy palace dog under the window, leaving the whole royal harem barren. Now, see. Here is a person, here is a poet who has his eye for the common minutest details, everyday experiences which are soaked in his poetry, but then there is one word that in a way actually takes you back to his own frustration or to his own disillusionment, where he says, which reminds me of the thrown away seed of the folk tale tree. So there is actually a meaning on it, there is a metaphor on it, a thrown away seed, because while being in Chicago, he himself at times felt isolated, how he was distant, but then how he was still related to his own roots. Now, if we can consider the general themes of his poetry, we have been saying that there is a conflict between tradition and modernity. Indian myths, history, customs and belief and superstitions, they actually can be found in abundance, fine. There is ancestral heritage and memory, but there is also fear and anxiety in a new place. In some of the poems you can come across, but then all these are full of diasporic experiences. Actually, Ramanujan tries to amalgamate, Ramanujan tries to annex the tradition and the modernity. He is not completely soaked in it, he is not simply for it, he actually wants to move, he actually wants to transcend. But then at the back of it, there is a memory which is there. Because in one of his earlier poems, he says, when we pluck a fruit, does the fruit forget the inverted tree? I mean, while he says all this, he is actually thinking of his own ancestral, family, his own ancestral memory. Can he really be totally terminated? Can he keep himself away from what he is? Now, the title poem of his very first collection, namely the Striders, where he actually makes strider a metaphor. Now, this strider is an insect, but then what he tries to say, what the poet actually tries to say through this is, he actually is struggling for his own identity, and then he says he just like a strider, but then he is on a search, and some of the lines are quite identical to his own condition. Put away this dream. Now, whenever anyone goes to the foreign country to earn a livelihood or for a profession, naturally he feels himself segregated. And then he says he goes there for a dream. So put away this dream and search for certain thin stemmed bubble-eyed water bugs. These water bugs which appear to be so indifferent, so insignificant. See them perk on dry capillary legs, weightless. Again, take this word, weightless. In one word, he actually talks about everything that he really wanted to. Weightless, no weight, no significance on the ripple skin of a stream. Not only prophets walk in water. It is not only that good people only can make name. It is not only that only the prophets can walk in water. Even this insect, this strider, the bug sits on a landslide of lights and drowns eye deep into its tiny strip of sky. So here is actually a sort of self-appraisal, here is actually a sort of self-comparison, here is actually a sort of self-exploration through the strider that the poet is actually trying to find out. He is actually looking and finding for a sort of, there is a sort of search, there is a sort of, identical search which he actually wants to have it, but then the poet himself at times feel to be very ambivalent. At times it may appear that through the foliage he actually wants to return to his root, but then he always wants to say that even when something is so insignificant, that does not mean that should be the end of the world. That is what actually the poet tries to say. There are many more lines in many more poems in the Striders. We can take some of them in order to evaluate this poet AK Ramanujan. Here is a poem of particulars. Now you see, this poet AK Ramanujan, as I have been saying, that he always tried to find the substance of his poetry in his own surrounding. Here is a poem which he calls a poem of particulars, but here the poet is actually looking at a basket of oranges and he compares human beings to the basket of oranges, to these oranges, while what he says is, but every one of these had an absurd, almost human umbilicus at the top, where once the tree had poured its future. So, when he talks of tree, he actually talks of his own roots. Had poured its future from forgotten roots and possessed it close to feel this fall-minded pot-bellied bud. Now look at the comparisons. The pot-bellied bud till it rounded for our baskets. Till it rounded for our baskets. So, what you see in baskets, have you ever thought of where from this came? From where did this come? Could you really find out? You perhaps were not able to find out. Then the other poem that is on the right side, you can find it is also about self-portrait, where the poet, once again the poet tries to have a look at his own self, and he says, the poem is titled Self-Portrait. I resemble everyone but myself. Now see the contraries. On the one hand, he is searching for his own identity. On the other hand, he is trying to efface himself. There is a sort of self-effacement. And in his self-effacement, he says, I resemble everyone but myself. So, the poet is once again saying that even though I look like everyone, but then I am not. And sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. Now, here there is actually, there is a connection. He actually, when he looks on the at the walls, and he finds as if he is also one of those portraits which have only been signed in a corner by my father. So, throughout you can find that majority of the poems of the first collection, that is Striders, they actually remind the poet, or they are the reminiscences of his past, they are the reminiscences of an Indian life that he has lived. There is another poem named Snakes, where when we talk about snake, we may think of it an animal, but then here also the poet actually shows how the Indians revere snake, even though it can create a sort of fear and anxiety among children, but then the poet actually describes it, that even though he is frightened, but think of his mother, who actually used to provide the snakes with jarfuls of milk. We can read these poems. I have already provided these poems. You can read it at your leisure, but I will simply take out some of the lines in order to make my point clear. Mother gives them milk in saucers. She watches them suck. Mother gives them milk in saucers. She watches them suck and bear the black line design etched on the brass of the saucer. And in the same poem, the poet not only talks about the snakes as being fearful, but this snake actually provides a livelihood to the snake man, and the snake man reads their writhing around his neck for father's smiling money. But I scream. No, the snake man, for his own livelihood, actually writes it around his neck, and the family members smile, but the poet is frightened. The poet is frightened. And then as the poem moves forward, even if you go back, you can find, I think of snakes, a basket full of ritual cobras comes into the little house. Their brown white glisten ringed with ripples. They lick the room with their bodies' curves. So, snakes are a common feature in Indian houses, and the poet actually annexes it to Indians' way of worshipping it, but at the same time, for somebody it may be a worship, whereas for other it may be a sort of profession, whereas for the children they are mostly frightened. Thus, if you have an analysis of these poems, and especially the poem entitled Snakes, you will find that it not only talks about the fear of the poet, rather it is actually a sort of obsession for the poets. And dear friends, there has been a long association of snakes in Indian mythological stories. You might have come across several of them in our ancient sacred texts named the Mahabharata. So, we find rather that it is actually a sort of indigenous tradition, and what the poet could see in his childhood that continues to play at the back of his mind. And that is why when he uses words like, fine, if we have once again a look at the poem, and the layers of transparency that makes them opaque, dwelling on the yellower vein in the yellow amber, or touching a book that has gold on its spine, I think of snakes. So, even when he goes to the libraries in the USA, and in and between the stacks and the aisles, whenever he sees something, he can actually think of, or he is frightened of, a snake. So, through this poem, the poet not only actually talks about the childhood memories, but he also talks about the association of snakes with Indian sacred rituals and all. And we also can say that even though the poet is in USA and he has got a modern outlook, so in a way he is also trying to find out, to create a sort of ironical situation, that how despite the fact that we have moved ahead, we are still not able to leave our past behind. It is actually playing on the back of our mind. The snake, which actually creates a sort of fear in the minds of the children, and which actually creates a sort of reverence in the heart and the psyche of the older people, actually is also a source of livelihood for the poor snake man. We have already seen in some of the lines that for the snake man actually gets money for this. So, while the poet also tries to show the sort of poverty that is there, so it can not only be associated with a sort of religious preference, rather it can also have an association with the sort of poverty that is prevalent, and that is why the snake man, out of the fun, even that can be a fun to many, that can actually be a sort of satisfying the belly for the poor people, and it is a blessing for the poor. And we can also say that even though Ramanujan is rooted in Indian culture and tradition, but yet he is not like other diasporic people. Say for example, if we talk about V.S. Naipaul, who, though he did not live or spend much time in India, yet he was thinking of India, he was writing about India, and writing in a very, very different manner. But then Ramanujan doesn't do that. Ramanujan actually talks about all the good things, but then that doesn't mean he is not critical at times. We can also say that Ramanujan is a poet of cultural consciousness, a poet of cultural consciousness. And on many occasions you can find that he has, in several of his poems, he has mentioned, because he seems to transcend from what he had seen in India, he wanted to move forward. So, there is a sort of transcendence in his poems, and what he has mentioned in his poems can give us two pictures. One, that India is a culturally context country. It is a context bound country where there is a context sensitivity. Whereas in USA there is a sort of context free country, and that is why in one of his famous essays entitled Classics Lost and Found, what he says is actually an eye opener. He says, Indian tradition is not a single street. Indian tradition is not a single street or one way street, but consists of many connected streets and neighborhoods. India does not have one past, but many pasts, my dear friend. It is actually right to quote one very famous critic and a writer of modern Indian English poems, Bruce King, who did an extensive research on Indian English poets. What he writes about this poem is, the poem presents an image, a complex of feelings, distilled memories and events which are not elaborated or commented upon. But as it begins in the present now of museums of book stacks which contrast with rural India, So, when the poet is thinking of the snakes, no, because the snake has become an obsession. So, Bruce King says that even what he does is contrast with rural India and family life. The poem celebrates the liberation from the fears of the past, ghosts which Ramanujan now feels safe. So, being in USA, he actually feels safe, but at the same time one cannot deny the fact, and majority of us are familiar with how snakes are being worshipped in India. No one might be unfamiliar with the name of Astik. Astik, who was the son of Jarat, Karu and serpent goddess Manasa, and it is said that Astika was the savior of King Takshak, and the same snake King Takshak had actually bitten Parikshit, fine, Parikshit's father, and that is why, in order to take a revenge, because the king died because of the bite of the snake, bite of Takshak, and hence in order to take a revenge, a yagna was conducted, and this yagna is called Sarpasatra. You can find more and more details if you have a look at our ancient Indian texts. My dear friends, we have come to know that Ramanujan, even though he went to USA and he continued there for so many years, but then he has not been able to forget his own tradition. And in one of the poems, what he writes is actually an eye opener. And when he writes that how still being in the US, he follows the Indian tradition. And let us take the lines of this poem from collected poems, where he says, "Yet like grandfather I bathe before the village crow. The dry chlorine water my only Ganges, the naked Chicago bulb a cousin of the Vedic sun, slap soap on my back like father and think in proverbs." So, he has not been able to obliterate his Indian sensibility, and that is why he says that I bathe before the village crow. I mean, there has been a tradition in India, there was rather a tradition to get up quite early in the morning and get a bath, a holy bath. This was actually a very famous with most of the Hindus. And the dry chlorine water my only Ganges. Here, being in USA, whenever I take my bath, I simply visualize that even this dry chlorine water is my Ganges. The naked Chicago bulb, a cousin of the Vedic sun, when he looks at the bulb, he actually visualizes the Vedic sun. Slap soap on my back like my father and think in proverbs. My dear friends, if we go on reading the lines of AK Ramanujan, there cannot be an end. AK Ramanujan is such a vast poet, and his poetry has got such an aesthetic value that one lecture cannot suffice. But then time always waits for us, and the time now indicates me that I should wind up my lecture, and I should continue the lecture once again in the next part of the same lecture, where I can delve deep, and I can also take you with me to see the gems that AK Ramanujan's poems possess. But at the present juncture, let me wind up and let me say that as Ramanujan continued his journey, and as he was in the USA, even though memory always kept flickering on the back of his mind, yet he also tried to involve himself to the best of his knowledge and to the best of his ability in the culture of America, or in Chicago, where he continued for a long time. So, before we come to the next lecture, till then, goodbye, have a nice day. Thank you very much.